Oh, hey. I'm not sure how to say this without making someone out there really mad, but I don't really care, so here goes. I like Dark Souls 2. There, I said it. I really like Dark Souls 2. Okay, I understand that liking Dark Souls 2 isn't exactly the most controversial thing in the world, especially considering the large number of other videos discussing the same topic. But I believe it needs to be said that Dark Souls 2 is underrated. Dark Souls 2 is actually one of my more favorite Souls games, so it is understandably pretty upsetting to me to see this game being trashed on so often. The negative discussion surrounding it has caused for people to avoid playing it altogether, and I think a lot of the hate for Dark Souls 2 is undeserved. But of course, that doesn't mean that some things aren't deserved. The main goal of this video is to highlight the positives of Dark Souls 2, but I will mention some of the things that I think drag the game down. I'm going to do this mainly because I don't feel like the negatives should be ignored. They do hold weight on the overall quality of the game itself, so ignoring them in my opinion would be in bad taste. A lot of what I will be saying in this video will be solely my opinion, so take of it what you will. It is always good to develop your own opinions, so if you watch this video and are interested in Dark Souls 2, then go ahead and try it out. It's honestly a good game, and it's worth diving into if you've played the other games in the series, even if this one ends up being the last one you do play. Now, with all of that being said, let's get into this. The first things I want to discuss about Dark Souls 2 are the game's mechanics. Many of the mechanics of Dark Souls 2 are unique to the game, and only a couple got picked back up with Elden Ring. There is one specific mechanic, though, that didn't make it into Elden Ring. Well, actually, the mechanic is more of an item, and that item is the bonfire aesthetic. I already made a short about the bonfire aesthetic, where I rather embarrassingly called it the bonfire aesthetic. But to summarize that short, the bonfire aesthetics are the only item in the Dark Souls series to directly affect the new game cycle. This makes it, at least in my opinion, the most unique item in the entire series. You burn the aesthetic at bonfires, and doing so causes the area near that bonfire to go up one new game level. This cannot be undone and even persists through normal new game cycles. If you burn an aesthetic, the area you turn into New Game Plus will become New Game Plus 2 when you start New Game Plus. This is actually really cool because it adds extra weight to this decision you've made and forces you to think about whether or not it's actually worth it to burn the aesthetic. It's not like the item is rare or precious, it's actually quite dangerous and should be treated as such. There's obviously some places in the game where it's safer to use an aesthetic, but all in all, it's a really cool item and honestly is my favorite part of Dark Souls 2. The way Dark Souls 2 handles New Game Plus is also one of the biggest positives I know about the game. It is the only game in the series that I feel does New Game Plus right. It isn't just a harder challenge with enemies having higher damage and health, it's also a partially new experience with new items and enemy placements. There's a full list of changes on the wiki for the game, so go check that out for more information. My favorite changes to the game are an additional counter with the Duke's Tear Freya, and some entirely new enemy encounters, including a new encounter with the Pursuer in Drangleic Castle. Dark Souls 2 really puts into perspective what New Game Plus could be and what, really, it should be. I personally believe the most replayable Dark Souls is Dark Souls 3 simply because of how fast you can burn through it on a second run. The bosses really carry that too, each one being an amazing stop on an otherwise speedy run through the game. But just think about how much better that could have been if there were more substantial and effective changes to the game that built up over the cycles until they capped at New Game 7. It would make the journey through the difficulty of New Game Plus that much more worth it if there were new encounters to fight through on each subsequent playthrough. Dark Souls 2 really had its heart in the right place with its focus on the cycle, and that is something I really hope becomes more prevalent in games in the future. Dark Souls 2 doesn't do New Game Plus the way I'm really describing, but at least it somewhat does it justice. Now, the one thing I will say that does drag the experience down in New Game Plus is that even though some encounters are adjusted, they still feel extremely ganky and unfun to deal with in some situations. Hyde's Tower of Flame specifically comes to mind, although this is strictly an issue with Scholar of the First Sin Edition. The Hyde Knights are already a little much for the area after beating the Dragon Rider normally, but combined with the extra Old Knights in New Game Plus, it makes for an overwhelming experience that I really can't call fun. That is an issue that is sadly all too common in the Scholar of the First Sin Edition. Enemy placement just feels off in a few instances. Some people will understandably have a better time with the enemy placement in Scholar, but for a lot of us, it was something that really just hampered the experience. And that is possibly one of the worst things about Scholar. It teaches people to run past enemies rather than fight them one by one. The vanilla version of Dark Souls 2 doesn't have this issue as much and is by far a more enjoyable experience with enemy placement. Now, while the enemies of Dark Souls 2 are somewhat lackluster, the bosses are anything but that. Okay, fine, alright, I get it. Okay, so some of the bosses aren't that good, and one is considered to be the worst in the series by many, but there are a lot of amazing bosses in Dark Souls 2. A good few of them, including my favorite boss in the whole entire game, are in the DLCs to the game, which include some of the highest highs and the lowest lows of all of the Souls games. With 41 bosses, at least a few are bound to be hits, which I will give Dark Souls 2. It does have a lot of road bumps and clutter, but at least most of it is optional, and it's all fairly unique with the exception of a couple of bosses. Dark Souls 2's bosses have a lot going for them. Even lesser bosses like the Pursuer are significantly cooler than many of the other bosses in the series. The Pursuer itself has a unique attack. It's an attack that, if you are hit by it, allows the Pursuer to use dark magic against you. An attack that changes the boss's moveset if it lands is one of the coolest things I've ever seen in the Souls series, and this belongs to one of the starter bosses from the game, which is amazing. The bosses also all have a unique design to them, each keeping to a very vibrant and well-shaped look that tends to match the area they inhabit. The bosses of Iron Keep both represent fire and have a twisted, demonic look to them that accents the keep itself, a castle cursed to sink further into itself due to its own immense weight, becoming further burned and gnarled as it is punished for its hubris. The bosses of the Lost Bastille and Sinner's Rise all represent it being a prison for the undead, the Ruined Sentinels being guards of the prison, and the Lost Sinner being the prisoner being guarded. The rat bosses are fought underground or in caves, the royal guards are all found in castles or defending the kingdom's royals, the green bosses are found in the green zone, and so on. Each of these bosses fits their area, and that even includes the weird ones like the Congregation. Dark Souls 2's highlights all mostly have to do with the game's visual design. Each of the areas, like their bosses, are vibrant and shapely. Even the most rigid area designs are pleasing to look at. There is a spectacular attention to detail in each of these areas. Some of my favorites being the ruins of the Forest of the Fallen Giants and the desolated Broom Tower. The Forest of the Fallen Giants being the ruins of a fortress in Drangleic, destroyed by the war between the Giants and King Vendrick, something that we get to see play before our very eyes later in the game. And the Broom Tower being the last great tower of the Iron King, built from the king's obsession with the strength of iron, brought to ruin by the immense greed of the old Iron King, forever stained with ash. Each of these areas has its purpose and its lore, and I haven't found a single one where I haven't enjoyed every second of study that I've put into them. One thing specifically that I love about Dark Souls 2 is its presentation of its areas. In many locations, you get a faraway view of the area you're heading to. This is something that the later games would do as well, but I feel is done exceptionally well in Dark Souls 2. When you enter the Huntsman's Copse, you get this full view of the undead purgatory before continuing through the area. The same is true when you enter the poison pools of the Earthen Peak, seeing the windmill far away, but not entirely out of reach. The only area I can really say doesn't do this and could benefit from including it would be the Iron Keep, considering how massive it's supposed to be. The way Dark Souls 2 presents its areas just feels incredibly memorable. I remember the entrances to most of the areas of the game just because of how well they present themselves. I am sure that everybody who has played Dark Souls 2 remembers going through the things betwixt, watching as the glow from the crack in the mountain grew brighter and brighter until you crossed through it and into Majula. The first time going through this was amazing, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. Walking into each of the DLCs had the same effect for me, with an added bonus for at least 2 of them where the kingdom is presented directly through this wide landscape shot, somewhat framed by things that are close by in the foreground. All of it feels very purposeful, like FromSoft really wanted you to get this idea of the lands you were setting foot in. I'm glad this design style saw a return in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. It's a little thing that I have grown to deeply appreciate. I have also come to appreciate the story of Dark Souls 2 as time has gone on. Many people believe it to be the worst in the series, and while I can understand that belief, I don't think worst is the best way of putting it. It is definitely the least tied together with the other games. The story is rather vague about the cycle of light and dark, and is vague about other things too, unless you are prepared to really dig deep to learn the story of Dark Souls 2. If I had to give the story a more correct description, I would say it is the most detached of the 3 games. It is weak when held up to the other games, but alone, it is still a marvel of storytelling. Unlike the other Dark Souls titles, Dark Souls 2 takes place in an unrecognizable kingdom, far away from the First Flame, or so it seems. Drangleic is commonly believed to be located far from the kiln of the First Flame in Lordran, but it is also hinted that by the time this game takes place, Lordran has already fallen to ruin, lost to time completely, with its lands being occupied by new peoples, the land also having taken up new form. Knowing this, Dark Souls 2 likely takes place in between the events of the first and third games. So, there are some spoilers ahead for the game, not like that really matters, but if you wish to play the game blind without knowing things beforehand, then skip to this timestamp on screen. Alright, for those of you who stayed, I will summarize the base story for you. I'm going fast, so I will be skipping over a few details. Drangleic was founded by King Vendrick, who ruled proudly. Over time, Drangleic flourished, growing larger and larger with Vendrick at the forefront of it all. He eventually met and married Queen Nashandra, who is actually a fragment of the Abyss from Dark Souls 1. It is close to this point that the undead curse began to show up in Drangleic. This meant that the First Flame was beginning to fade, and Vendrick being human made him susceptible to the curse. Like in Lordran, the undead were hunted down and imprisoned, many of the locations in-game being places where this imprisonment occurred. As his kingdom fell, Vendrick tried finding out the source of all the darkness in Drangleic. He discovered that all of the issues in his kingdom arose after his marriage with Nashandra. She asked him to lead his kingdom to war. She herself came from a kingdom that had already fallen into ruin. She had been there at the beginning and was still there at the end. Vendrick then realized what Nashandra was, and what her plan was, that plan being driven by her immense lust for power. So, knowing this and what she was after, he had himself locked away. He knew that if he did not open the way to the First Flame, then she would never be able to reach it, and this is what he did. Nashandra was kept out of the First Flame, denied the souls and thus the power she desired. And as fate would have it, Vendrick hollowed away in his eternal prison, guarded by his most trusted soldier Velstadt. This is where we come in. We arrive in Drangleic to kindle the First Flame. Well, kind of. We come to take the Throne of Want, which is pretty much keeping the First Flame lit. And depending on what we say to Aldia, we also get the option to refuse the First Flame and usher in an Age of Dark. It is the same end goal, but with a different name. The story of Dark Souls 2 is one of my favorites in the series, and its connections to the game's DLCs is one of the most unique I've seen in the series so far. Dark Souls 2 takes its own concepts fairly seriously. The depth of the game has kept me interested in it even years after my first playthrough. Again, this also somewhat falls apart in Scholar, with some mechanics changing slightly that don't make sense in the wider sense of gameplay, but along the terms of its story and its focus on that story, the change between versions doesn't matter at all. Just about everything in Dark Souls 2 has a connection. Some bosses are tied together, as are some NPCs. This is true even in the DLCs, the DLCs themselves being more of an extension of Vendrick's story, showing the events that occurred in other kingdoms where a queen entered and a kingdom fell. Well, in all except for one. In that DLC, the Crown of the Old Iron King, the kingdom had already fallen to ruin, so the queen that would have been simply set up shop there, waiting for someone to arrive and take that power. If you do not plan on playing the game, but are still interested in the story, then I strongly suggest looking up explanations of the story on YouTube. There are many great videos by Vaati Vidya on the game, and each go into incredible detail on the story. Vaati's videos are all exceptionally well made, and I recommend his content to anyone who is looking for a little more about the FromSoft series. To end off, I would like to briefly mention some extra things that I personally enjoy about Dark Souls 2. These aspects to the game are highly subjective, and some of you may think these things differently from me, so just remember that this is simply my opinion. If you disagree or have more to add, then feel free to leave those thoughts in the comments. I'll be happy to read them. Starting off, life gems have had a bit of a rocky standing among the players of Dark Souls 2. When I first played the game, I actually hated them. To me, they felt like a cheap way to up the difficulty. After my first playthrough though, I came to really enjoy life gems. They gave me a backup option just in case I lost all my Estus, or if I got hurt on the way to a boss and needed to pick me up but didn't want to use an Estus. Life gems for me have stayed the same since then. As a backup option, they aren't too bad. I understand that having an infinite supply of them early on can hurt some people's opinion on them, and that is a criticism I do share about them, but overall, I'm quite fond of these little gems. Speaking of life gems, there is a larger focus on the consumables in Dark Souls 2. A lot of them are versatile and fun to use, especially with a magic build, as many of them help magic builds to be more viable. Dark Souls 2 also gave us the first instance of respeccing our stats. This is done through a soul vessel at the first firekeeper you spoke to when you created your character. It just seems like there is a lot more at your disposal in Dark Souls 2, and I didn't feel this way about consumables again until Elden Ring. Now, there are negatives to this game, and while I won't ignore them, I'm not going to go super in depth about them, but I will mention two specific ones briefly. Those two being adaptability and animation timing. Adaptability being a level that improves how well you do different things, like dodge and drink Estus for some reason. This stat hurts balancing and is why many of the janky hitboxes in Dark Souls 2 exist, as many can be avoided, but only with high adaptability. Now for animation timing, the animation timing in this game is actually quite slow. You have to wait for your animations to end before you can begin another one. This hurts survivability and leads to what is known as turn-based Dark Souls. It slows the gameplay down, which, for a game series that focuses heavily on its combat, is just horrible. Zero Lenny talks about these two negatives in his video and goes far more into them than I just did. I will leave the link to his video on Dark Souls 2 in the description below, so go check that out if you want to hear more about the game's more annoying touches. There is something that Lenny also talks about in his video, something that he calls the most important part. To him, and to me, the most important thing about Dark Souls 2 is that none of the negatives matter if you actually like the game. If you enjoy Dark Souls 2, even with all of its issues, that doesn't matter if you genuinely enjoy the experience. While I can't say the negatives of Dark Souls 2 can be ignored, they definitely can be embraced. I have my issues with the game, but I enjoy many of the game's aspects, so I choose to embrace the negatives. Negatives that I must understand are part of the game, something that I must overcome in order to see the game's positives for themselves. It is something that I'm glad I've done, as it has allowed me to gain a new perspective on the game, one that I'm sure is available for many of the people who have played Dark Souls 2. I hope that this video has encouraged some of you to play Dark Souls 2, either for the first time or for another playthrough. This game truly does get more flack than it really deserves, and I'd like for more people to play it and gain an opinion on it for themselves. It sucks knowing people intentionally ignore it simply because of the things they hear about it. With many of the people who are trying the Souls games out because of Elden Ring, it seems like a good time to give Dark Souls 2 some attention. Hopefully, it will eventually get seen more positively among the community, and if not, then oh well. Dark Souls 2 will still be there for those of us who enjoy the game and wish it well. Dark Souls 2 is truly special, and I will always treasure it. And hopefully, one day, you will too.